I mean, we've yapped for like 2 hours.
Hour and a half.
Hour and a half. We've yapped for an hour and a half prior to this. We
Oh,
can do this.
but we started to have the podcast personas.
This is our podcast opening. We've told you that we've yapped for an hour and a half and we're sharing personal stuff. And
And we are very nervous,
maybe at
that's why
some
we are yapping.
yeah, at some point we'll get to the point.
Why are we making romance great?
I mean, yeah,
Why not
why not
again?
great again?
Right?
Do you want to take that?
Do I want to take that? I don't know if I want to take that. Probably because romance was never great. Let's start with that. At least it was never great in, let's say, common sense. It was never considered as a great literary genre. It was never contemporary fiction. It was never poetry. It was never fact literature. So if you say romance, like what is the first adjective that comes to your mind? Silly.
Yeah, I was
Or
just about to say
or if
silly.
someone asks you like what do you read? Do you answer, "Oh, I'm reading romance"? No. You would ask, "Oh, it's just a silly romance." Or it's like, "Ah, just a romance, just a romance, a silly romance." Why is that? Because I
Yeah.
used to do the same. I
Oh
used
God,
to
yeah.
do the same, and still I need to catch myself every single time if someone asks me like, "What do you read?" I would be like, "A romance." If it's silly, I would say it's silly, but I try not to say it because generally speaking, people who do not read romance, they would consider their romance always being silly.
Yeah. And even though as the people who do read romance, we acknowledge there's a lot of silly stuff, like suspension of disbelief that's needed for romance isn't always that different from the suspension of disbelief you need for fantasy. Let's
Yes.
face it.
Yeah.
Like we're suddenly led to believe that yeah, this billionaire fell in love with a commoner, or that I almost said that that this man is actually in touch with his feelings, but that's a bit harsh.
It is
We
still a
know,
suspension of disbelief. This man knows what he feels. And
yeah, that he's
he's happy to like first acknowledge it and first make other people realize what do they feel. It's like it never happens or rarely
and
happens, let's
he's
be
insanely
honest.
attractive and he makes the woman come first and all of that.
And he
Yeah,
has
the
money.
suspension of disbelief, and he has money, the suspension of disbelief needed is quite high. But also, I think we can't say let's make romance great again, because as we said, it's never been great yet.
Or
When
it's
you
never
ask
been considered great.
Because when you ask someone, name a great crime novel, name a great fantasy novel, you
Oh
have
yeah.
examples. Agatha Christie, Lord of the Rings, there are examples of great novels in other genres, but not in romance. We're slowly getting there a little bit. And some people might try and say, name a great romance, Pride and Prejudice. No one necessarily thinks of Pride and Prejudice first as a romance. Gone with the Wind, Romeo and Juliet. Literary snobs will always find a way to take these works back into something that is not romance because they don't value romance as a legit genre. Anything that could be perceived as romance that is objectively a great work of literature is immediately taken as far away from romance as possible so as to not devalue the work.
Absolutely. So, Gone with the Wind will be a great historical novel. Jane Austen will be, well, not contemporary, historical fiction in its time. And it's very sarcastic. It's very society
Observational.
related. It's very observational. Absolutely. So, yeah, there is a romance, but it's not the most
Mm,
important. Fucking hell, have we read the same novel? The romance is the most important thing in almost all Jane Austen's novels, besides the one I forgot the name, besides Mansfield Park,
okay.
because
Yeah.
that one is slightly different, and it was the novel when Jane Austen was in her most conservative era. And you can actually see it when reading the novel. But yeah, I absolutely agree that the literary snobs, they will always find a way to do the yes, but. There will always be a yes, but. So there is a novel, sorry, there is a romance there. Um, but the romance is not the core of the novels they want to be snobbish about. Why not make romance great again? Because even if something is romance as a genre, the literary snobs will say it's not. It
Mm.
has the elements of romance, but it's not a romance. And I used to be there as well. I'm not gonna I'm not going to lie. I always loved reading romances. Almost always, I would say.
Mm.
But I loved, absolutely loved saying, this is not a romance. And when I read romance, I would be the person who is saying, just a silly romance. Jane Austen,
Mm.
no, this is one of my favorite authors, but she did not write romance. So I never read Gone with the Wind, so I can't say. But Jane Austen was the person. The same with Charlotte Bronte. How do you pronounce it
Mm.
in English? Is it Bronte or
Bronte.
Bronte? Bronte, okay.
Bronte.
So the same with Charlotte Bronte.
And Emily
Jay,
Bronte.
nah, I would argue here.
But people will sooner consider Wuthering Heights a romance and absolutely misunderstand the entire point of that book
Yeah,
than call Jane Eyre a romance, which is an interesting duality in itself that I hope at some
it's
point
very
we'll
interesting because
dissect.
I would say it's absolutely the other way around.
Exactly.
So
Jane
starting
Eyre
here,
is such a romance.
it is. And Wuthering Heights is full of all of the romantic things, but understood not the way we understand romantic now. So it's very dramatic. It's full of big emotions, traumatic emotions, not necessarily good emotions. We will have love, yes, but it's very overwhelming. It's very toxic. We will have dramatic scenes, dramatic landscapes, dramatic places, abandoned villas, people who are very lonely, but they're consumed by their emotions, their grief, their anger. This is what we would call, what people used to call romantic. Now we would call it gothic.
Mm, absolutely. And yeah, it's the fact, just to take it back to like the point of why we're doing this podcast, it's the fact that people will still say Charlotte Bronte and Jane Eyre, it's a literary classic. It's one of the greatest works of Victorian fiction. It's one of the best novels written by women at that time. But they will still say there's a romance plot in there, even though, let's face it, the book is entirely a heroine's journey from semi rags to riches, getting rid of the other woman, not actively, but trying to eliminate her from the picture, going through her own growth to allow herself to love Rochester and for Rochester to be worthy of her love and having that happily ever after. Every single thing that like organizations who define romance as a genre tell you needs to happen. And yet it's Wuthering Heights that we say, this is the romance. Kathy and Heathcliff, so tragic.
Well, let's start with that Wuthering Heights, it's not as much about Cathy, it's more about Heathcliff. So here we have the
Absolutely.
first switch. It's not heroine's journey, it's rather hero's journey to his miserable life.
Yeah, Kathy exited the picture very quickly.
She did, and she was a bitch. Anyways,
But this also leads to like the other point that we floated about earlier in how when people talk about romance as if it's silly, it's just a romance, it's not serious literature, we're also it's almost saying that people who read romance must also be simple, that if you're reading this simple schematic repetitive predictable silly stuff, then you must not be a very intelligent person. And that's incredibly harmful because every single person that I know who reads romance as avidly as I do is one of the most intelligent people I know. They're the people I have very intensive and very educational debates about romance as a genre, but also about life, politics, misogyny, sexism, all of that.
what if not?
What if not?
What if they weren't the most intelligent people you knew? Does this make romance not great? I mean, like, Yeah, I agree absolutely. That loads of people who read romance and people I know, they will be super intelligent, educated people. But on the other hand, like most people I know are very intelligent and educated. So probably this is just my bubble. But
Mm,
what if they weren't super educated and super intelligent? Should we have the green light to condemn romance? It's like, oh, now we can do this. We can say romance is silly because its readers are silly. No,
no, definitely
no,
not.
because a lot of people who are not highly educated would read crime novels. And no one would ever say crime novels are just silly. If you ask anyone, what do you read now? And they would never say just a silly criminal.
No, that's absolutely true. People read stuff of
People
all
read
genres.
stuff, period.
People read stuff. That's what we want you to take from this podcast. But no, there's something that's been said in one of the articles that we've been read that we've both read that said how a lot of the studies that were done on romance are taking some of the worst or just not very good examples, and every genre has good examples and bad examples. I said so earlier, people can easily name a great crime novel, a fantasy novel, sci-fi, whatever. There are great examples of romance novels, but hardly anyone is taking them into consideration because guess what? That defies the point of, oh, yeah, look, you can have romance that's intelligent, well written, and yes, it's a story of two people falling in love and their circumstances. If it was good enough for some, if not most, literary classics in most literary canons, why is it not good enough for popular literature?
If you are waiting for the answer why romance is not great and why literary critics keep condemning romance novel and its readers, and why is that? Why does it happen? You will not get other answer rather than misogyny. But
Yes,
we will
we
get
will
to that
come.
later.
And we will come back to this point numerous
We
times
will come back to
because
most of the points many times.
ultimately what we want to do in this podcast is less talk about individual books, even though we'll bring that into the mix, but talk about more literary theory and treat romance with the level of seriousness and respect that we think it deserves, as well as vent our thoughts.
And rant a lot.
Rant a lot. There will be plenty of rants. And also, and that's going to start explaining a little bit about why do we think we're the people to do it. But also, we're not just going to be, here's what the Brits have written, here's what the Americans have written. We are both Polish.
Boom.
Yeah, boom, mic drop, in case,
Slavs enter the scene.
Slavs have entered the chat. And also, hopefully, we've preempted the you have accents, where are you both from questions.
From Eastern
We are
Europe.
the accent. God. But yeah, we are both Polish. We're from Eastern Europe, but we also, on top of that, speak other languages, and we, when we can, read in other languages, and we read authors in translation who are not British or American. We read literature a little bit more globally. That tends to be what you see on Book Talk and Bookstagram and them lot, which is very obsessed with the most popular stuff, and that inevitably tends to be British or American. Second point that we'll be bringing up a lot, imperialism.
You can still expect a lot of reviews of American books and
Oh,
American
yeah.
authors because pretty much everything that comes from the US makes its way to UK and
Mhm.
to continental Europe because I don't want to call it Europe because UK is still Europe even though it's not
Yes,
European
yes.
Union.
But yeah,
Anyways, when did you start reading romance books? Just a little bit about ourselves.
when
What's
did
your
I?
name actually?
Yes, I think it's a worthy point that we actually introduce ourselves and not just talk about the podcast. So, my name is Paulina, and when I speak in English, I go by Paulina just because otherwise it fucks with my brain.
My name is Monika, and the only difference in my name in Polish is different accent. So it's
I
very
mean,
easy
yeah,
name and I love it. I used to hate it actually, you know.
I used to hate my name as well. But anyway, yeah. So my name is Paulina. I live in the UK, hence why I'll be making a lot of British references. And I think of the two of us here, I probably read a bit more romance, or that's the main thing that I read. And I'm still trying to remember how old was I when I read my first romance, and I want to say I was probably about 12.
I was a little bit older. I think I was 15 or 16. The internet already existed in Poland. What is more, it existed in my hometown.
I know.
So the first books I read, I found it on some pre-Facebook social media, which was solely made for Poland, for well, Polish people, by Poles for Poles. And I found there the Norwegian saga of Ice People. It has
Mm,
52 books. They were very short books, and oh my God, I just fell I just fell for it.
mm, yeah. Mine was, I do remember very distinctly, like the book itself, the very first one I read, because it was a slightly different publishing company, but it was the equivalent of a Harlequin or a Mills and Boon. It was in a kiosk next to all the various magazines that you'd get. So it was clearly stuff that was acquired cheaply, printed as inexpensively as possible to sell a lot of copies. It had the very typical romance cover of a guy with a naked chest holding a woman in his embrace, and they both looked very broodily into each other's eyes.
The Bodice
And
Ripper.
yeah, although for a bodice ripper, it was surprisingly gentle. Like
Okay.
that one, I remember it was Susan King, and I'd have to start looking up what the book was called in English, but it was one of like the Scottish, the Victorians in Scotland, that
Oh, yeah.
historical romance type thing. And I remember I bought that in secret because I was terrified that my mom would say, "You're not allowed to read that thing." And I read it with like the cover against my legs in a day.
Was it still in Poland?
Yeah, it was.
And they sold it to you. Jesus Christ.
That was another thing I was terrified of. I was like, "Oh
I
God,
can only imagine
I don't know what made them do it." I mean, it was a person
money
working
made
in
them
a
do it.
there's this, but also it's a person working in a kiosk in a supermarket at the magazine stand. Like they don't make a lot of money. Why do they care?
Well, they can't really tell you, I will not sell you a book, honestly.
No.
It's not
So
alcohol or something.
yeah, that was what hooked me. So from that point on, I started acquiring more romance and reading more romance. Even up until then, I might not have been reading romance, but I was in love with love stories.
Oh, the same. But
Yeah.
I didn't read that much romance at the beginning. I was looking very actively for as many love stories in the books I read. And
Mm.
being 15, 16, I already read loads of fantasy. Oh, I was a liar, dirty liar. The first romantic books I read was when I was in secondary school, sort of. So being 13, 14, maybe 12, maybe even before. There was this series in Poland that roughly translates to not for mom, not for dad, but for every teenager, something like that. This is very rough translation. So they were young adult novels before the young adult was actually invented, or a
Yeah.
genre was called this way. So they were very short novels as well. They were very proper. They also
Mm.
focused pretty much on love. Very, well, typical if it comes to the plot. So
Mm.
they met, the relationship started to begin, they fell in love, then drama happened. After being parted by drama, they were united again. So all of this started this way, but there was always something else to the heroine's journey.
Mm.
Remember one of the story. They all of them they were in the US, obviously, because well, Polish publishers always loves the America. So as it's still now. But yeah, I remember like most of them they had something more to the story. So not only finding the Prince Charming in the local high school, but something else, like discovering that she loves to run or she loves to, I don't know, paint or whatever. So there was a love story and a personal journey as well. So
Mm.
these were the first books. And maybe, just maybe, I when I started to grow up, I started to think about romance novels as a silly books.
That is interesting that that was your journey, because yeah, you've had that exposure to stuff that was age appropriate for the age you were reading it
Oh
at,
yes,
that also had that personal growth aspect to the stories. Whereas I I did read teen books for teens, but they were always very much about like girl friendships, and I jumped straight into adult romance
yeah.
pretty much.
I didn't. The first like adult romance novels that were actually called romance novels were the ones you gave me.
Evil laugh. Yeah, this is how we connected. We connected online. We met online, and we've been friends since teen years. I think it's actually going to be like 18 years or something stupid like that at this point.
We're very old. If you didn't
We're
notice,
ve-
we are very old. And the
we're very
podcast
old.
is made by millennials for millennials. If you're Gen Z, you're fine.
You'll probably find that if you don't agree with millennials, you will not agree with us. But yeah, we met online because at that time there was a thing on Polish blogs where you could have a blog and people would send you their blogs when they were writing fiction or fan fiction, original, whatever, and you could mark it and score it and basically give like a very extended review. So we connected through that because I was already writing romance at that time, and I asked you to read something of mine. And even before that, we'd sort of started chatting, but because you'd read what I wrote and was very kind, way too kind for what
Oh,
that
I
thing
love
deserved.
it. I love it.
But
I was 100% sure that I will hate it because Paulina was writing the fantasy romance blog. The name was literally the fantasy romance, so she
that
did it before it
was,
was cool.
yeah, I'm trying to think. That was, we connected when I was already in the UK, so that would have been like 2007, 2008.
Yeah.
So I was writing fantasy romance back then, bitches. Take that.
Yes. And I was 100% sure, like keeping in mind that I loved love stories, but I hated romance for absolutely no reason. But getting the blog, the stories on the fantasy romance, I was like, heaven forbid, I don't really want to read it. And I loved it. Surprise,
Yeah.
surprise.
And then I told you that everything that I know about romance came from the author I was obsessed with, and that's how you read your first proper adult historical
Yes,
romance,
was
because I
Stephanie
practically made you Stephanie Lawrence,
Stephanie Lawrence. Yes.
which
It was
I,
very Regency,
yeah,
very
yeah,
classic novel, very classical plot. They
mm,
met, like I think in every book they met, they kind of dislike each other. Then they dislike each other, but there was always sexual tension there because there's
mm-hmm,
always sexual tension in this classical romance novels.
mm,
But then there will be like the very typical things, the kiss with something else, the kiss
mm-hmm.
with more of the something else, then the sex, then the second sex, then the breakup, and then the love sex.
She was my first real insight into, because I very quickly caught on, like, yeah, every book is pretty much following the exact same formula, almost down to a T. And that was my first insight into, well, this is how genres develop. Someone does something, and we all agree, okay, these are the points that a story needs to hit to be this genre. Like these are the meet cute, the how do they get together, the a little bit of bliss, the conflict, the resolution, happy ending, or happy for now of some sorts. Because I've almost always read romance and almost always wrote romance and still do to this day. Not only I'm coming into this podcast from a perspective of a fan, but also from very much the perspective of someone who's sick to death of both me doing the thing that you said, oh, it's just some silly romance. It's just a, it's nothing big. No, I am done with that. Romance deserves respect because it is a genre just like any other. And I am sick and tired of the creeping erasure of romance as a genre. And if you're in the UK and listening, go to your local Waterstones and tell me if your Waterstones has a romance section in the shop, because they sure do online, but none of the Waterstones shops that I went round to had it in store physically.
I can't say the same about Polish bookstores. There is loads of romance everywhere.
And it's labeled as romance.
I think so, but
Go,
I'm not
that's your homework.
100% sure. This is my homework. I will go there and then we will re-record some stuff possibly.
Or just pick it up in the next episode.
Or just like that. But very often the romance will not be called romance for
Mm,
reasons, but you will
misogyny.
get the you will get the romance books somewhere at the very entrance to the bookstore,
Mm-hmm.
but it will be called differently,
Mm-hmm.
starting from bestsellers to
Mm-hmm.
TikTok sensation to TikTok or Instagram or BookTok or whichever book media made me read it, etc.,
Mm,
etc. And most of the books, let's be honest, that will be romance novels. But will they
mm-hmm.
be called romance novels? I highly doubt that.
No, and I've noticed that in the UK as well. Like as Valentine's Day comes round, there's tables of books marked with to get you going, Valentine's Day reads. And then outside of Valentine's Day, they will pick some sort of a euphemism of to get you hot and bothered and stuff like this. So yeah, romance is still absolutely in shops. It's not labeled as such. And if you're trying to find romance specific stuff, unless you already know what romance books look like, what the covers and the current trends with covers are, you would probably just look at it and go, oh, that's that's something weird. Like the fantasy romance that's right now, you can mistake it for fantasy. The contemporary romance and the popular romance, you look at the covers and it looks like teen novels.
What is more, the publishers, I think, intentionally make you think that this is something else but not romance.
Mm-hmm.
Just look at the initial marketing of the Fourth Wing. It was first, I don't know how it was actually in the US or in the UK, but in Poland when it got translated, before the publishing, it was called the fantasy novel. Well, of course, TikTok sensation, the bestseller in the US and in the UK, etc., etc., but it was marketed as a bestseller in fantasy genre. And then
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people bought it. And then, if they were not a fans of romantic plot within the novel or fantasy romance altogether, they'll be like, "What the fuck is that? Why are there dragons fucking?" This is spoiler, sorry. As Paulina said, the main literary genre she reads is romance. For me, it's not exactly the same. I read loads of romance novels, but I also read a lot of other books with main genre I read would be fantasy and science fiction. And I'm not going to brag, oh, this is very serious science fiction, very serious sci-fi. No, it's not. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not.
I mean, people
But
used to think of science fiction and sci-fi as this is kid stuff, this is silly, this is not serious.
this is the very magic book, right? This is the stupid
Mm.
books about elves and fairies, etc. Have they ever heard about Wingspan? I doubt that. Sorry, I had to just inject it here. Anyways, I read loads of romance novels, but this is not the main literary genre I would read. But I always, as I already said, I always loved the romance plot within every book I read. And at some point, I was actively looking for books where the romance plot will be very big. Not the main one, but very big. And when I started my adventure with writing, I was always thinking this is not a romance. But now when I read what I used to write back then, it's like, yeah, this is definitely a romance. Maybe the ending is not very romantic because it was never classic happily ever after, but it was very, very, very important in the book. So at some point, quite recently, I stopped, swagging and bragging like, oh, I never wrote romance. Yeah, I did. Anyways, so even though I don't read mostly romance, I read a lot of it. And romance is one of these genres that has a lot to offer, and there is a lot to discover in the genre itself, in the novel. So I'm very interested in a slightly more critical approach. You will find me ranting quite a lot about stuff because I get angry very fast, but I also get calm very fast. So maybe you will discover this in this podcast, but I can't promise that. So the critical approach, a little bit more literary critique perspective, but I promise you there won't be anything about romance destroys the literature or romance make people divorce or romance doesn't, I don't know,
Romance is
romance
the reason why men underperform in the bedroom.
romance is the reason why women do not want to get married. So, what you can expect from the podcast in the following episodes? You can expect us ranting about books we are reading or just
Hmm.
screaming to the universe and for you to read the same books that we read. There will be mostly romance novels, but not always.
And you'll also find that we naturally gravitate towards slightly different kinds of romance. And the stuff that we both read often is because one recommended it to the other or because it really is that popular.
I think the genre within a genre that connects us would be historical romance, I would say.
Or fantasy,
Oh,
fantasy romance.
no,
No?
no,
Okay,
I
then
love
historical.
fantasy and I love romance, but I don't really read fantasy romance. I loved
Okay.
Fourth Wing because it was so tropey and I found there everything I loved. But I don't really like fantasy romance.
And we will at some point have a big rant about Sarah J. Maas because you cannot talk about fantasy romance without talking about Sarah J. Maas.
Yes, you can expect that. You can also expect that talking about heroes and heroine. Why heroines are like that, whatever that means. Why heroes are like that and why are they always tall ones?
I think generally our intention is to focus less on individual books and more on the bigger trends, the bigger topics and themes within romance and on the various aspects that are an inseparable part of the genre, whether that's tropes within the plot, whether that's the characters, whether that's how romance originates, like fan fiction or original stories, and dissecting it as other people dissect crime and classical literature and drama and every other literary genre. We want to talk broadly about things that are not just in one book, but that start to spread across multiple.
And we will also try to have a closer look to the myths that started to rise around romance books. So, is it always about sex? How realistic is that? Does it really make women be alone because the standards for the guys are being too high? What are the differences between classic and new romance, etc., etc.? So, as Paulina said, there will be a lot of things that spread across different romance books rather than talking about specific books we read, although you also have conversations about exact books as well.
We will make our tastes and preferences known very clear.
Starbucks. What? Have you heard anything?
I I didn't hear anything.
Yeah, that's fine.
I just had a little cough. And above all, I think this podcast is an opportunity for us to hopefully not just connect with each other as good friends that we have been for a number of years, but to also give you those two different views of romance as a genre. You will have probably a little bit more gushing and a little bit more positivity from me and a little bit more scathing criticism from Monica.
Every
But
time you will hear, but actually, it's like, have you considered? It will be me.
and very often, probably more often than not, I will go, huh, that is interesting. I have not thought of that. And
And
that
I
is
still
also the
don't
point
care.
of the podcast. Have you considered Wingspan? I still don't care. Because ultimately, I feel like amongst readers of romance, that is the kind of types of people that you get. You get people who more or less unquestionably dive into the genre and go, I'm reading it because it's fun and it's making me happier and I'm enjoying it and it's great escapism. That's me. And you get the people who do that as well as think about what they've read and go, but this could be better, but this doesn't quite work. I see what you tried to do there, but it hasn't quite worked. And that's Monica.
But it will still not stop me from giving it 5 stars. What we also would try to do is not to get very defensive about reading
Yes.
novels, because what we notice doing initial research on the podcasts and people who read romance, etc., this is very understandable, but also quite tiring, I would say, at some point, that people are getting so defensive about reading romance, and they get defensive from loads of point of view. So getting defensive because literary critics hate romance, but hey, they hate fantasy as well. Getting defensive because some feminist will say that romance can be toxic, etc. Hey, it can be toxic and you can still read it and you can still enjoy it. Guess why?
And also getting defensive because someone had the audacity to say that actually this romance is absolutely groundbreaking and it's doing so much more and start to take the romance, take the story into another genre just to make it more legitimate and then be like, but no, this is still romance. Like there is a lot of defensiveness that we are both trying to shed, and ultimately this is a safe space to just let a romance be what it is. So tune in and make sure that you listen to our podcast wherever podcasts are listened to by you. This is very awkward English, but I am keeping this. Listen to Make Romance great wherever you can. We would love to have you on board. Tell us your thoughts and find us on social media at Make Romance Great underscore pod on Instagram and TikTok. Am I right?
I think so. It's very hard not to add again, right?
It's so hard. I think we're going to have to come up with some sort of a short name for this podcast. MRG doesn't roll off the tongue very nicely either, but we will need to have a nickname for the podcast because otherwise we will keep slipping and calling it Make Romance Great again when
Yes.
that's not the name.
Even if we don't say again, it's like there is just this very tiny, awkward pause. Make romance great. And
Yeah, we'll see what comes out of it. But yeah, we plan on delving into as many topics as we can. We've brainstormed so hard and we have more ideas than we can possibly tackle, but we want to tackle them all eventually.
we will get there.
So thank you for listening and see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.